You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 315 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, a very frequent guest, Brian Saady, returns to talk about the trial of El Chapo. He had a recent piece in the American Conservative on this that was absolutely fantastic. And so we're going to be breaking that down. Then, of course, since he knows so much about Latin America and Venezuela, he's going to be talking about that a little bit too. Brian, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
All right, well, if anybody hasn't gone to Brian's websites and stuff now, you definitely need to. His website, briansaady.com. He's the author of the book series Rackets on why, we need to end the drug war and legalize prostitution and gambling and all this other stuff. And he's the host of the Rackets podcast, which he has fantastic episodes that come out every so often. He had a pretty good one on El Chapo recently, so all that could be found at his website, so make sure you're checking out his work and supporting him. But let's get into this here, Brian. So tell us, who is El Chapo?
Well, I would say, even if you don't follow organized crime or drug trafficking culture, all this kind of narco culture, I'm pretty sure, everybody who's listening has heard the name El Chapo. But I guess you're really asking that question because, again, he was recently convicted on, I think it was all 10 counts, various different drug trafficking charges. But yeah, as everybody knows, he's basically the leader, or was really the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, which for roughly over a decade was the largest drug trafficking organization in the world and still arguably holds that place. But to get into that question, that was essentially one of the main defense ideas for El Chapo. And again, if you were a lawyer for El Chapo and the evidence that he was facing in that courtroom, you basically got to throw out whatever Hail Mary idea you can to try to win the case for him. And there were a few different ideas that they were going at, one of which being that El Chapo wasn't really the leader of the organization. And there may actually be some truth to that. Long before he ever went to prison, if you kind of do some research and dig around there are a lot of people in the know who've often suggested that not that El Chapo wasn't a leader within the organization, that he was really more like the number 2 guy, or you could say 1A or 1B with a guy named El Mayo. And you probably haven't heard of El Mayo, and that's for good reason. Although he's also one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, unlike El Chapo, he has stayed in the background and done it in a very good way. Never been arrested. He's done one interview, and it was with a fairly obscure Mexican news outlet. Well, actually, I shouldn't say obscure, but really didn't even acknowledge any of his own criminality. Basically, just said that he's a farmer and a businessman. But one of the things, and I mentioned it in the article because that may seem like just a preposterous idea that El Chapo, he's obviously sort of the face of the organization. Everybody kind of knows him for breaking out of prison and these underground tunnels that, tunnel drugs across the border and tunnels, to break out of the prison, just everything in just this very, high profile, spectacle kind of a way. But it is possible that he really was sort of the number 2 or the 1B guy of the organization. And it just kind of sparked this one example in my mind. It has to do with the Genovese crime family. There's a guy named Fat Tony Salerno, and kind of like El Chapo, very much a public face of the crime organization. Just kind of always had this cigar and a certain look about him that just sort of the persona of a gangster. And at one point he was actually on the cover of Fortune magazine when they did this story detailing organized crime. I think it was back in like the early 90s, if I remember right. But long story short, Fat Tony Salerno actually was the number 2 guy in the organization. He was this very public face, while a guy, Vincent the Chin Gigante, actually really was the leader. And he actually fooled law enforcement community for many years. He basically had this sort of persona as a crazy man. And actually once after he was busted, it actually worked. He got off on the charges on illegal insanity defense. Basically he would roam around the streets in a bathrobe, mutter to himself, just mumble and really sort of delivered on that persona. But later on, the FBI agents kind of got a bug in one of his offices there, and they caught him just kind of openly talk about how he had really delivered on this scheme. And again, they captured that, and he was eventually convicted. But just to sort of get that point across, that it is quite possible that everybody who sort of views him as the world's biggest narco trafficker, that it's possible that he actually wasn't. But that's really kind of splitting hairs, because at the end of the day, that was sort of part of the defense's strategy that, well, he's only number 2 in the organization. Well, you're still a major leader in the largest drug trafficking organization in the world. But yeah, it is very interesting that sort of you can kind of see law enforcement authorities, they'll tout this as a win in the war on drugs. And I kind of basically have some mixed emotions about the case. When you look at the case, as far as just the evidence that was collected, I mean, it really is impressive. Even though I'm an anti-drug war person, there are a lot of people who risk their lives to go through and make this investigation. And it really was an impressive piece of work that was all put together there by them. But at the end of the day, the person who was either number 2 or 1B is still free. And I'm referring to El Mayo, and the organization still keeps running along. There's a lot more violence in the country. But yeah. So yeah, just to kind of get back to your point, you're asking really who is El Chapo? But yeah, he's somebody who's been, really at the top of the drug world for roughly over 2 decades now. He fled the country back in 1993. He was basically had this murder pinned on him. It had to do with a very high level member of the Catholic Church. And by all indications, he actually wasn't the person who committed the murder. In fact, he was actually the target of the murder. But this murder ended up getting pinned on him. He fled the country, went to Guatemala, bribed a number of different politicians, and had safe haven for a while. But again, he was brought back to Mexico, but he was running the organization behind bars. And, for almost a decade, was building up this organization from behind bars, basically living the lifestyle of a narco behind bars with prostitutes that openly walked in there, just did whatever he wanted, and eventually broke out back in 2001. And that had a lot to do with the guy who's nicknamed Elicionado. It's a word I can't pronounce easily, but basically in Spanish, it's translates to the licensed person. So in other words, a lawyer. And this guy was basically like a high level official in that prison, which was supposed to be one of the top maximum security prisons in Mexico. But he's the one who helped to get, among many other people, helped to get El Chapo out of that prison. And then he actually became a very high level member of the Sinaloa cartel. And he was actually one of the many witnesses who were actually testifying against El Chapo in this trial.
So I guess just understanding here, even if he's not number 1 in that cartel and he's number 2, he's still guilty as hell of enough to put him away for life, right? His defense has nothing to do with I didn't kill people or anything like that. This, guy was a ruthless member of a drug cartel. But I was just wondering, what territory did this cartel control, or what kind of drugs were they transporting? I guess, was it all heading up towards the American border and selling it in the U.S.?
Well, El Chapo was sort of you go back to the early 90s, you gotta need a little bit of the background. In the 80s and let's say early 80s to mid 80s, there was a group called the Guadalajara cartel. That was by far the most powerful cartel for many years there. There was a guy called Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. That name sounds familiar. Probably some of your audience, they're watching the latest season of Narcos, or if you just follow this stuff in general. But basically, this guy was the catalyst for just organizing crime in Mexico. He was nicknamed the Godfather for good reason. He could basically get all of these different criminals to sort of get on the same plan, keep the infighting to a minimum and just keep it to business. And eventually that cartel, fell apart. I could talk forever about that. So I'm trying to be as concise as possible. But basically, El Chapo he was a driver, basically like a hitman, security guy for the Godfather. But eventually, the Godfather went to prison and basically kind of split up the cartel and gave, different territory to different leaders. And El Chapo got a region called Sonora, which, as far as if you wanted to have the most profitable regions as far as Mexico, it's a very good one, but there are better ones. If you could basically picture the U.S. geography, and it'll sort of make sense. If you were taking drugs from the border, say San Diego would be a great place to break in there, along the Texas region, but Arizona, you've got to travel further along the highway system to get to major metropolitan areas. So he was more centrally located. His region borders Arizona, and he was basically just sort of this innovator. We've heard about these tunnels, kind of a little bit recently, but this has been going on for many years. The first time he actually started to do it back in 87, because his region didn't really connect with many major highways. And it's something that I guess it is very topical today, because guess what? We've had this government shutdown. Trump wants this border wall, but it's not based upon any sort of factual evidence to have this border wall. Yes, in these regions where we don't have a wall, somebody could say throw like a couple kilos of heroin or cocaine in a backpack and walk across the border with it. Sure. But that's really a very small piece of the pie, an incredibly small piece of the pie. Most of the drugs in this country, they've come in here by boat, but really most of it comes in the back of an 18-wheeler truck. It's mixed in with all different types of legal products. It's hidden there in plain view, and it comes in on major U.S. highways. And it's very evident because we see where the violence is highest in Mexico is along those border cities that border a major U.S. highway. And again, El Chapo's territory really wasn't one of those parts. But at the end of the day, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, Trump can get his border wall. Maybe it'll happen, but it's really going to have next to no effect on the actual supply of drugs that come into our country, because at the end of the day, they're smuggling it in plain sight in the back of like a back of an 18-wheeler, in the back of cars along major U.S. highways. And the border wall will do nothing really to stop that. Sorry, I kind of got a little bit on a rant there.
Can you go ahead and then tell the specific anecdote from the trial with the chili peppers?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. And basically I was telling you about, this underground tunnel. So the first time he builds one, it's back in 1987. And it's really just kind of an indicator that I think a lot of times people view like a drug trafficking organization as just a bunch of dumb meathead criminals. And there is obviously some truth to that. But at the end of the day, oftentimes these guys really are very cunning and very ingenuitive. And to build a tunnel that spans from one side of a border to another, it takes some pretty smart engineers and some pretty smart people. And although they're criminals, these are smart people who are outsmarting the authorities. But eventually that one border wall, it's back there in Douglas, Arizona, the authorities came upon it actually by chance, shut that down. And, so to build another, border wall was going to take some time. So El Chapo basically had to scramble. And one of the ideas was to actually smuggle them in these, what was it? Yeah, jalapeno cans. And there's this one popular brand in Mexico that's got FDA approval. So what they tried to do was actually purchase the company that makes them. But the company that makes them refused to do so. So basically, they invested the money in their infrastructure, and they built this sort of technology that could basically just build just beautiful counterfeits of that legitimate product with the label and the canning and everything. And then that's how they would smuggle in just tons and tons of cocaine. But yeah, basically El Chapo has been, if you look at it strictly from a business perspective, take all of the morality out of it, has been really a brilliant businessman as far as narco trafficking. He diversified his different trafficking routes, and a lot of that had to do with just plain warfare, fighting different cartels to get that sort of territory. But a lot of it was this sort of ingenuity with coming up with these different ways to hide the product in plain sight. But yeah, one of your earlier questions was like, what type of drugs did the Sinaloa cartel traffic? And basically everything. Afghanistan for good reason, is known as basically the opium capital of the world. But the United States isn't the only place that consumes opium. I mean, there's a global demand for that product. And Mexico is actually the third largest producer of opium in the world. Now, it's a far distant third place, but a very large percentage of the opium that comes into our country is produced there in Mexico. So yes, the Sinaloa cartel, they produce and manufacture the opium there, along with a group of other organizations in Mexico. They traffic in cocaine. They're one of the main transit points because the coca plant doesn't grow in Mexico. It really only grows pretty much in Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. So it's concentrated in that area, but they're really the conduit there. They also produce and manufacture, I shouldn't say manufacture, but traffic in marijuana, also methamphetamine as well. So basically, pretty much whatever illegal drug, wherever there's a demand, the Sinaloa cartel was fulfilling that demand and bringing it there as well.
So let's talk about some other highlights from the trial. Do we have any idea of how many people, El Chapo is actually responsible for, having killed, either ordering the killings or did he spark drug wars, and just anything else that you thought from the trial stood out? And I did want to ask you specifically because there's a lot of pick outs in the media for the sensationalized story. So there was this one. A woman apparently said that he slept with 13-year-old girls or something like this, that there was a lot of pedophilia going on there. I was just wondering if you had any idea as to if that was happening too.
It certainly seems to be true. I mean, this guy, really was a sadistic individual. And that's kind of one of the things I was commenting. So yes, I'm happy to see this person. This person doesn't deserve freedom. He belongs behind bars, in my opinion. He's one of the most notorious criminals in the world. But at the end of the day, it's actually a net negative for society, in my opinion. We talk about in war scenarios like in Iraq and Libya, where there's this power vacuum, whereas again, nobody will tout the human rights record of Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, but with their removal, it created this power vacuum, which in my opinion, I think you share my opinion, has made matters actually worse for the world and in those regions. Well, guess what? It's the same thing with the drug war. When you removed El Chapo, it's just been a catalyst for mass violence. If I remember right, in 2017, Mexico hit a record level homicide rate. That record was broken the next year. And again, a lot of it is concentrated in these particular areas where drug trafficking is at the high point. And again, it's mostly, rival cartels, but also by removing El Chapo, you've created a power vacuum even within that own cartel. The Sinaloa cartel was not your sort of hierarchy, vertical organization. It was very much a horizontal organization where these different, very high level cartels basically pool their resources together. So when you remove one of those ringleaders, there's just basically been rampant warfare among the different factions of the group. But yeah, I just came across, after I printed that article, this study was just released, I think a few days afterwards, where they said that there's 1.1 million domestic refugees in Mexico. And that is almost entirely to do with the lack of security in the country, specifically as a result of the drug war in their country. And think about it, even though Mexico is very large in size, its population is quite a bit smaller than the U.S. I mean, imagine if in the U.S. there were 1 million people who literally were refugees within our border because the violence was so high. But then to actually get back to the murder count, this was not included in the trial, but I think it's very relevant. Mainly because the U.S. Notably did not use any sort of Mexican law enforcement official as a witness. It was entirely either U.S. officials or drug traffickers who've been convicted, who were basically working as government witnesses in exchange for cooperation with their sentences. But after El Chapo was captured, it's been so many times, I can't remember if it was the last time or the next to last time. But basically, like in this, quick sort of moment of candor, when he was getting questioned, the Mexican authorities said to him, well, you're responsible for 13,000 murders. And his just, knee-jerk reaction was, oh, no, maybe 2,000, maybe a couple thousand. And it's something that he just sort of says, matter-of-factly, that, he's responsible for a couple thousand murders. Personally, I think he's probably responsible for even more of that, maybe not directly, but indirectly. Because again, his cartel, really grew in size in part, through a lot of bribery. Well, not in part, largely due to a lot of bribery of government officials, but it was also in part from just sheer force by taking on different rival organizations. And he also was able to, gain a lot of power because of those government connections. Oftentimes, if you look at the stats and look at the arrest records, the Sinaloa cartel, even though it was the largest cartel by far in the country for many years, would have the fewest number of arrests. Whereas these other groups, although they're major organizations, would have much higher arrest figures, which, I mean, that's circumstantial, but it's very clear what was going on in this country. He really essentially bribed and coerced his way to the top of really the criminal underworld. And at the end of the day, the country is, even though you would think that, getting him out of this country and throwing him in a maximum security prison in the U.S., at the end of the day, in my opinion, the Mexican people, sad to say, are actually worse off by creating this sort of power vacuum in their country.
Well, yeah, and I guess I would just add, like, obviously the solution isn't then to just leave El Chapo in power. It's to end the drug war. That's right. What's going to make things better, is that, by creating this black market, you're inherently creating the violence. It's just gonna happen. And so you're either going to continue to have the violence because of the drug war, and leaving El Chapo in power doesn't mean no violence at all. It just means slightly less. So if you end the drug war, then, normal businesses will start to take over the, distribution and sale of these products, and, they'll stop shooting at each other.
Right. At the end of the day, and again, if you've never heard my words before, you might think that I'm some sort of person who's sort of like glamorizing drug use, because that's sort of how it can get twisted. It's not. I recognize that there is a lot of damage that can be, that can happen to society as a result of drug abuse and drug addiction. But the prohibition is so much worse than the actual, damage to society from drug abuse and drug addiction. It only compounds it, makes it worse really in every way. And again, we see it here within our own borders, but we don't really know, we don't get to see it, or it's something that many of us forget. You see a headline about some sort of mass grave in Mexico or some mass shooting, involved with, a drug war. But it's just something that I think we're all pretty guilty of it. You sort of become desensitized to it. But really, the real damage is just so much far worse outside of our borders, where really essentially where the transit routes, I guess you could say, where it comes from the source country to the end destination.
Yeah, well, it just seems interesting that, that for these countries, especially a lot of them, I think being smaller with smaller, less developed economies than the U.S., it's a massive portion of their economy that ends up kind of in, this underground black market. And it's just, devastating. So I guess generally, do you have anything else that you want to add? Because I want to ask you this question specifically, but we mostly already answered it, I think, is, how do you win the drug war if taking off the biggest, cartel boss doesn't do anything to help end it?
Right. I mean, that's, I tend to sort of beat a dead horse, but yeah, I mean, in my opinion, there really is no real answer other than to end this prohibition. And I think that some people who have the same stance can sort of oversimplify it and pretend that all of these problems will go away. They won't. There will still be criminals, but this would have a dramatic difference. So, by what I mean by that is, so we're talking about the Sinaloa cartel. They're known for drug trafficking. Well, guess what? They're involved in all kinds of organized crime. That's everything from fuel theft. All of the different cartels in particular, they're known for extorting, the citizens in their region, robbery, all kinds of different crimes. But there's arguably no more profitable crime than drug trafficking. And once you take away that revenue, it would just have a dramatic effect in so many different ways. For one, yes, you would reduce the level of violence in these different countries tremendously. It's not going to eliminate it, but it would have a dramatic difference. And the thing is, in many ways, well, for one, once you take away that revenue, then you take away a lot of the ability to bribe the government officials that are necessary to keep these organizations in check. Once you do that, then you can actually have somewhat of an effect upon what I call the non-consensual crimes. And by that, I'm referring to the different extortion and robbery. And a lot of times, well, basically you mentioned it, right? So El Chapo, right? He comes from really just a totally poor region of the world where he's from, in his hometown in that region. Guess what? He's basically a hero in the eyes of many of the people in that region. It's this region where there's really no real infrastructure, where the only thing you can do is farming. It's tough to actually export your product unless it's something where there's this high demand product where drug traffickers can fly in there. And it's the same thing like in Colombia. So in some of those regions, a person like El Chapo oftentimes is viewed as a hero because he's brought so much economic development to their region. But yeah, at the end of the day, there really is, in my opinion, no real solution to all of this violence other than to end that war on drugs, to remove that prohibition. And again, I don't want it to preface it like it's some sort of panacea and like everything will be perfect, because it won't. There'll always be criminals, but you would really dramatically cut down on, all of the different collateral damage by ending that prohibition.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about the violence in Mexico just real quick before we move on to Venezuela here. Just because I feel like the reporting on this gets a little sketchy, as it sometimes comes off as like pro-Trump, or there's a lot of like right-wing interests who want to inflate and kind of exploit the violence in Mexico to advocate for a more restrictive immigration policy and a border wall and all of that. So right. I guess, how bad is it? I think I saw a statistic recently that there's like 35,000 deaths, or 30,000 to 35,000 deaths in Mexico in 2018. It was the most violent country in the world. Talk about rampant kidnapping, heads in coolers, journalists and politicians being killed. Is it really all that bad?
I would say so. I mean, and I kind of preface it this way. Now, it's not that way throughout the entire country as well. There are also parts of Mexico where it's actually pretty low crime, but that's also typically in regions where it's not really a part of, if you just sort of look at that natural infrastructure of transportation. So certain regions are sort of key to moving products and goods. And it tends to be in those regions, where it's outside of that infrastructure where there is a lot less violence. I think we can kind of oversimplify it, exactly like you're saying. Like some people can hear that and say, maybe I never want to go on a vacation to Mexico or something, because at the end of the day, violence is still a very low, the odds of you being a victim of violence are still very low. It's just that in this particular country, it's much higher than most countries in the world. But yeah, to kind of correct you, it doesn't have the per capita highest murder rate in the world, although many Mexican cities do. I wrote an article a while back, and it looked at the 50 cities with the highest murder rates in the world. And 47 of the 50 were in this hemisphere. 3 of them were in South Africa. So, and I think like 5 or 6 of them were in the U.S. And my conclusion is that this almost entirely is a direct result of the drug war. The vast majority, I think 17 of them were in Brazil. And of those 17, I believe that 16 were along the coastline. The reason being, Brazil is one of the major exporters of cocaine. So controlling a key point in the geography for trafficking creates a lot of violence. Mexico is something like 15 of the top 50. A number of different countries in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. So again, it's all of these sort of key regions in the trafficking of drugs that leads to just so much violence. So, I just don't see any way how you can't conclude that. But to basically get back to your original question, that there really is rampant violence. It's much higher than most regions of the world. It's one of the most dangerous places to work as a journalist. There was close to, think about this. There were close to 200 different politicians, either candidates or people holding office in the last elections last year who were murdered. It's just that idea is basically, it's just so foreign to us here in the U.S., but that's what the average Mexican has to live with down there. That's how much power the criminals have. It's hard to have any kind of a functioning society, and the overarching problem is this war on drugs. And as you mentioned before, it's something that's bothered me. Exactly. You'll see sort of very like neocon coverage of this type of news, and their response is, we need our border wall, but again, first of all, that will do nothing to stop that violence. Again, the real source of that violence is the war on drugs, is the prohibition. But yes, there is just a ton of violence down there, well above average levels, and a large percentage of it is tied to this prohibition of drugs.
All right. Well, that was a great article linked in the show notes page and the American Conservative. I hope you continue to write on kind of, this drug war and the effects on the region, just because I don't see it, well reported very often. And so I'll keep having you on the show if you keep writing about it. I did want to ask you about Venezuela before we end today here, just because I know, you just know a whole lot about this kind of what's going on there long running. So I just was wondering kind of what's your take on what's going on right now as far as, I guess, do you have like an opinion on who has more legitimacy to be president of Venezuela, whether it's Maduro or Guaido or somebody else, or, kind of what's going on? Is this just a kind of foreign coup d'etat effort, or is this, a popular uprising in Venezuela? And I will say that me and Brian sat down and did a whole episode on this topic. And so if you want to hear all of his thoughts and opinions, go back and listen to that episode. But for today, just kind of go over what you think about what's happening in Venezuela today. And you can mention the concert as well, which I think is going on as we speak.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to answer your question with a joke of mine that is just not once landed, but I find it hilarious, so I'm going to tell it anyway. So I'm in Florida, so I have a lot of different either friends or acquaintances who are either of, who come from, Central and South America. So all my various different friends and acquaintances who are Venezuelan American, I just kind of walk up to them and say, by the way, my name's Brian Saady, and I am now officially the president of Venezuela. And I will tell you, dead face, that's the reaction. Now, again, I get it. It's not the funniest joke, but to me, I do find this whole situation absurd in so many ways that a person can just sort of declare themselves the president. But let's just go back for a second. Again, you mentioned our last podcast. I am in no way a supporter of the Maduro regime. Basically, if you go back and you listen to that podcast I just tried to basically overload you with information, making the point that essentially he's running what you could call a mafia state, a narco state, a organized crime state, whatever you want to call it, just a deeply corrupt regime with a horrible human rights record, lousy domestic policy, just an awful regime. And basically, one of the final points that we were talking about is you can have all those different things, but to me, really sort of the final straw. And again, the Maduro regime has made many sort of attempts to really just destroy the Constitution, any sort of, checks and balances of power in that country. And in my opinion, the final straw was the 2017 assembly election. And by that, what I'm referring to is there's a lot of evidence that there was widespread voter fraud. And again, you can go into the details of that in that episode. But in my mind, that is the final step. There are a lot of corrupt, awful regimes in the world, but at the end of the day, if that's who the population votes for, well, that's who they voted for, as long as it's a free and fair election. But in my opinion, that was not the case. And there have been other elections in that country where people have alleged that, but I don't really view it that way. Even though I may hate the guy who's in charge, but if that's who they elected, and there's a lot of circumstances, that you can point to where Maduro's done really everything to not really have a true fair, or I should say to truly have a true fair political landscape where, opposition ideas are open and free. I mean, and that's not the case. But essentially get back to your question. You'll sort of see this media narrative where it's sort of good versus bad. And to oversimplify, I view it as bad versus bad. I would essentially call what's happening kind of like a geopolitical coup. And I would really point to really an excellent article by Max Blumenthal called The Making of Juan Guaido. Long story short, he has done some really impressive investigative journalism. And if you've ever looked at his work, one thing he really nails really well are all these different forms of, U.S. aid and of what we call foreign aid in many ways is really just part of the American empire. Where basically, but long story short, he makes the point of pointing out how these different groups from the National Endowment for Democracy, how this is all tied to the CIA. And again, I would just sort of point to that source because I just fully agree with really everything he said in there. And I think it's just brilliant work pointing out how, I would not really call this a populist uprising, although I wouldn't say that the support from the opposition isn't genuine, because it is. I mean, Maduro is highly unpopular. But this in many ways has been orchestrated by outside forces. And in particular, I mean, the U.S. has been having these sort of back channel negotiations or talks with different Venezuelan opposition for quite a while. I mean, it's not even something that's in secret. This is all out there in the mainstream media. So I would just basically call it, I don't know really what you call it. I don't really view either side as legitimate, I guess is the basic point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, well, I guess the hard thing here is that, there's different ranges of illegitimacy as far as election goes. I mean, you have situations like in Egypt where Al-Sisi, I think, rounded up like his next 18 challengers and threw them in jail, and then won with 95% of the vote. And
Right.
so Maduro it has more, I guess, support than that, and his reign is more legitimate than that. Although, of course, we'll back Al-Sisi, with all of our kinds of taints and weapons and military aid and everything like that. And yet we have to go overthrow Maduro because of the popular will of the people. It's quite ridiculous. And then the fact that we had to do this dumb disclaimer every time that, no, we don't support Maduro, the reason that we're questioning this is just because it seems kind of far from the truth. And, the very important role that, as you point out, Matt Blumenthal has there with the, NGOs and how they basically funnel U.S. aid, into different opposition groups to facilitate our regime change efforts has really resulted in this soft coup that, and you think the U.S. has had a pretty big role in, I guess, orchestrating all this? Do you have any ideas to the, extent of the U.S. role? Would it have happened if, Guaido didn't get permission from Mike Pence to move forward here?
I don't believe so. No, I don't. I mean, he literally made the announcement, if I remember right, a day after the meeting with Mike Pence. I don't quote me on. I guess I shouldn't say.
No, you're right, because I said Pompeo, but you're right. It was a meeting with Pence. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and that's the article where it says that I guess only 4 other opposition leaders, other than Guaido in Venezuela, actually knew he was done to declare himself president. There are people on stage with him who had no idea that was going to happen. He said it, and then they walked off.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is all entirely orchestrated. That's been sort of one of these big stories about how John Bolton on his notepad had the note with the 5,000 troops to Colombia. As you mentioned earlier, there's this. It's just sort of a spectacle environment. As we're talking here on Saturday morning, there's a concert that's going to be going on today, right there on the Venezuelan and Colombia border, where it's supposed to be how we're going to send this aid to the Venezuelan people. So you have I guarantee you have a very savvy audience, and I'm not saying it to brown nose. I'm saying it for a reason, because they have a healthy level of skepticism. But if you're just the average person kind of going about your day who kind of casually follows news, and you heard about, hey, sending humanitarian aid to this country of Venezuela where millions of people are fleeing for, humanitarian reasons, well, it just seems very reasonable to send that type of aid. But you have to understand that in many ways, it's kind of the Trojan horse, that there's a long history with this type of aid. You look at the Ukrainian coup, was that 2014, U.S. aid was behind that. I'd kind of like to mention the Iran-Contra affair, because, we had Congress had authorized, humanitarian aid to the Contras. Well, it turned out, after many years later, what we found out was that this humanitarian aid was weapons and, basically this gun for drugs and guns running operation where, many of the different companies that were contracted, to deliver this quote humanitarian aid were some of the world's biggest drug traffickers. For instance, there was a company called Setco. It was owned by the largest drug trafficker in Honduras, a guy named Juan Mata Ballesteros. And there was just this long list of these different, companies and drug traffickers who were, tasked with delivering this sort of humanitarian aid. I just don't believe it's a coincidence that suddenly Elliot Abrams is the person who's appointed to be the special envoy for Venezuela. And I'm pretty sure a lot of your audience will recognize that name. He's been with the National Security Council, with the George W. Bush administration. He was basically the biggest cheerleader for the 2002 coup attempt on Hugo Chavez. So this guy's brought back into the mix. He was actually convicted for his role in the Iran-Contra affair. He was later pardoned. But basically, long story short, this person's, just an absolute cheerleader for the neocon agenda. I was really happy to see him get some very public criticism recently from Representative Omar in regards to just different massacres that have occurred, in El Salvador and Guatemala for which this guy was basically, he calls it freedom fighting, or I'm paraphrasing, but I forget the exact term, but basically he was a major supporter of the Cold War. And in many people's eyes, in order to win this Cold War, we just had to look the other way at basically what was genocide or just widespread massacres by our allies to kill every sort of, communist sympathizer or anyone who's even presumed to be one. And basically history is repeating itself here. What I'm really disappointed in is, I get it. This is what the U.S. does, but there are I think like 50 other countries who are recognizing Guaido as the leader of Venezuela. And I just think that it's really a horrible precedent. And again, this is coming from a person who is about as strong of a critic of Maduro as you can imagine. So,
unless my stat may be out of date, but I thought it was only like 24 or 25 countries that were recognizing Guaido.
You may be right, but that's still that's 23 or 24 more than I would hope for.
Right, and it's countries that carry a lot of weight too. You know what I mean? It's not
right.
Like
Canada is one of them.
Yeah,
Canada
a lot
has
of
a
European
good reputation.
countries. And the last thing I'll ask you, and then we can wrap up here real quick, is do you have any? Can you speculate a little bit for us, or do you have any idea on what happens with the aid? Do you know where this is going? Is it? I mean, to me, it kind of looks like it has fizzled out, but with this aid thing, they're really trying to push and keep it going. I heard a whole bunch of Venezuelan lawmakers or like opposition lawmakers are walking over to the border or something ridiculous like this. So it's certainly not done. And do you have any idea where it goes from here, or what maybe people should watch out for, or where you would look to news to get honest reporting on what's happening?
I mean, I think it's tough to say. I mean, literally as we were talking, or right before we started recording, I have a friend, an acquaintance. His name's Toby Muse. He's a foreign correspondent for a number of different newspapers, and he's writing a book basically about the drug war in Colombia. He's in Colombia. He's live tweeting now, and I'm not a fan of necessarily calling live tweets news. I think that's thrown around a little bit too much, but I do think it is interesting and it is information. But yeah, he's literally right there at the border while this stuff's going on. There are a number of different. Some people have actually been killed in this melee. There have been some members of, different different law enforcement officials from Venezuela who have jumped the border. Man, I'm kind of at a loss for words basically, but it's just disturbing on many levels. But, as far as the aid, I think that the U.S. will continue with this strategy because, again, at the end of the day, the U.S. government really doesn't care what people like you or I think, people who have a healthy level of skepticism and understand history and see these repeated trends in which, we use terms like the National Endowment for Democracy and U.S. aid and foreign aid. And again, we both know, your audience knows that in many ways this is really a Trojan horse, but the average person, the majority of Americans really don't know about this type of stuff, doesn't know about that, our actual U.S. foreign policy and all of the really complex details that go along with it. Because at the end of the day, it's a really strong message. You've got this country where people are starving, where they don't have medicine. And what do you see on the news? You see these boxes with, what was presumed to be actual U.S. aid. But we don't know all else that's going along with it. Just to kind of throw just a little curveball at you, there's, the story down in Haiti recently of these, very well-armed people with U.S. military backgrounds who were just arrested. And it happens to be at a time during mass protests in Haiti. So in other words, what I'm trying to say essentially is just the U.S. has its hands in many pots, and we're always trying to, overthrow or manipulate whatever government we can to advance our agenda, essentially really our economic and military agenda. And I don't foresee this going away. I mean, because like we said at the end of the day, like, is it a populist uprising? Sort of. The sentiment from, millions and millions of Venezuelans is genuine. They do want to see it. Many of them do want to see an overthrow of the government. But at the end of the day, this is all very, very coordinated and orchestrated by the U.S. and condoned by a number of different world leaders, credible world leaders.
All right, well, I guess we should wrap up here. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I wish we had more time to talk because that story in Haiti had really caught my eye, especially since those 5 Americans have been returned to the U.S. and are not facing any kind of charges whatsoever. Right. How does that happen? They're caught in the country's capital with a bunch of automatic rifles. They have fully automatic rifles, but I don't know what a world we live in, and I'm glad you're doing all this work in Latin America and on the drug war because it's an important story that doesn't get covered enough, but the U.S. foreign policy is really the cause of so much pain and suffering. So I had to get you back on the show again to talk about more and more detail and everything like that, but tell everybody where they can find your work and what they should do if they want to make sure they're getting everything you're putting out, like your podcasts and articles.
I guess the direct source would be my website. It's my name, Brian with an I, last name Saady, Saady. I'm on Twitter and Facebook there, Instagram, I guess, as well. But it's all, my usernames are my name, Brian Saady. And like I say, I write for a number of different organizations. I produce a podcast. I have 4 books out there. One of them is, like I said, a book series called Rackets on the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. So yeah, if you liked any of this content, I think you'd probably find what else I have to say probably pretty interesting. And it's tough because we talk and it's amazing how an hour can go by, and it's like I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface of so many of these different issues. So yeah, if you want to support my work, again, I think you would find it pretty interesting and informative. But yeah, like I said, you can check out my website, follow me on social media, maybe check out some of my books as well.
All right, thanks for coming on the show.
All right, well, thank you so much, man. I appreciate you for